Hello and welcome to the MUI UI PowerPoint training. Today we're going to be discussing the differences between UIs and MUIs. Sometimes this can be confusing for providers. We're also going to talk about the definition of an MUI and what categories there are. There are several categories varying in severity. We're also going to discuss reporting requirements. This is very important because there are timelines that have to be met as far as when you report to the county board. We're also going to talk about who to report to and when to notify law enforcement and children's services. First, we're going to talk about UIs and how to write a UIR, which stands for Unusual Incident Report. What is an unusual incident? Well, an unusual incident is an event or occurrence that is not consistent with routine operations, policies, procedures, or the ISP, and it is not an MUI. For example, if something is documented in a person's plan, like they have a seizure disorder, and while you're providing services for them, they have a seizure, this is not unusual for them. However, an example of something that you would want to write up and report would be if the person had a seizure, and during the seizure, they would fall, maybe hit their head on a piece of furniture, and there's no significant injury. This is something that you would want to write up because it's unusual. UI investigations. A UI investigation must be completed for every UIR that's written and submitted to the county board. UIs must be reported to the county board the same day of the occurrence. It's important to figure out what exactly occurred and ensure immediate action of the individual. You'll want to assess for injuries. If there are two individuals involved, you might want to separate the individuals, or if it's involving an individual and a staff member, separate them. You'll want to call for assistance if it's applicable, and notify the guardian if there is one, or home staff if they have one. It's important to determine causes and contributing factors. Why did the incident occur? And develop a prevention plan to keep it from occurring again. This is a requirement for provider compliance and licensure who must report. You must do an UI investigation. Direct support staff, transportation staff, secretaries, and any employee or board member of a county board and independent providers must write UIRs. What information must be included on the UIR? Well, we need demographics, such as the individual's name, their address, a date and location of the incident, and a detailed description of the incident. The more detail that you can provide will help the MUI contact determine whether or not it needs to be sent over to the investigative agent for an MUI consideration. We need to know the type of location and if there were any injuries. Type of location could include maybe the person was at their home, or possibly work, or a day program. We also need to know the immediate actions that were taken to ensure health and welfare. For example, if there's an allegation that a provider abused an individual, we would need to know that the provider agency would remove that provider from working with that individual immediately. Name a primary person involved, or PPI, and their relationship to the individual. You'll want to think of this as the perpetrator of the incident. In cases or allegations of abuse, the PPI would be the person that was the abuser. This is not the name of the individual. Providers sometimes get this very confused, but this is the person that the allegation was made against. Any witnesses to the incident need to be reported, and if you can get statements from them, that is helpful also. We need to know who you notified. Did you notify the provider agency that you work for? Did you notify the county board, the police, children's services, or the investigative agent? We also need to know if there was any further medical follow-up. For instance, if the individual hit their head and had to be taken by squad to the hospital, we would need the discharge information from the emergency room. Of course, all incident reports need a prevention plan. A prevention plan, again, is to decrease the likelihood of the incident reoccurring. Causes and contributing factors, and the signature of the person completing the incident report. Sending UIs to the Erie County Board of DD. The rules are different for agency providers and independent providers. Agency providers are not required to send their UIs to the Erie County Board of DD. They are only required to send MUIs. If a provider is unsure as to whether an incident is a UI or an MUI, they can forward it to the MUI contact. The MUI contact will then take a look at it and email them back, letting them know why it is just a UI and why it is not an MUI. If it is an MUI, you will receive notification that one has been filed. Agency providers may not have to send their UIs to the county board, but they are to report all UIs for the month on their UI logs. All independent providers, both waiver and individual budget, must report all UIs and MUIs to the county board. Trends and patterns on UI logs. I'd like to start off with what is a trend or pattern. A trend or pattern is any incident that is similar in nature, the same type of incident or the same staff person involved, that occurs 3 times in a week or 5 times in a month. A month is not a calendar month, it is 30 days. So it could be an incident that's happened 5 times between October 15th and November 15th. Waiver providers are responsible to notify the SSA of any trend or pattern of UIs and MUIs for a specific individual. This is to be notated on the bottom of the UI log. Trends and patterns are reported on the monthly UI logs that are submitted to the county board. Providers are requested to submit 2 quarters of UI logs annually. So 6 months of UI logs will be sent to the county board. The county board will notify providers at the beginning of the year which quarters they are responsible to send. UI logs are due to the county board by the 10th of the following month. So if you are sending the county board a log for March, it would be due to the county board by April 10th. All UI logs are to be emailed to Sharon Saberna. Her email is ssaberna@eriecbdd.org. UI logs only need to be completed by waiver providers, both independent and agency. The incidents that are on the UI logs must contain a brief synopsis of the incident that happened, including the name of the individual, a brief description of the incident, any injuries that occurred, the time, the date, the location, and causes and contributing factors and preventative measures, or your prevention plan. Although the provider has not sent the actual incident report to the county board, any incident that is on the UI log must have an incident report written for it that the provider keeps. If the MUI contact has any questions about what happened on the incident when they are looking at the UI log, they may contact the provider and ask to see the original incident report. If a UI log does not include all the information that is on this slide, it will be sent back to the provider for corrections. This is our way of helping the provider so that when an audit is done, all the information is there. Now we will move on to the MUI portion of the training. MUI stands for Major Unusual Incident. There are many different types of MUIs ranging in severity, and we will review all the categories in this PowerPoint. Who do you notify if there's an MUI? Well, you would notify the Erie County Board of DD through the MUI contact, and we will explain this process in a future slide. It is the provider's responsibility to notify the guardian of the individual if the individual has a guardian within reporting timelines, which we will also discuss in a future slide. If an MUI has been filed, the Erie County Board will email the provider and the SSA a notification that has been filed. We also will notify the guardian if there is one as well. The provider reporting the MUI must also notify the residential provider that the individual has, if there is one, within reporting timelines. This communication is very important for continuity reasons. Let's say Johnny fell at Dahab and was squatted to the ER, but no one told his home staff that is waiting for him at the house. This could be a big problem. We need providers to communicate. All county boards have a 24-hour reporting system. This is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. There's always someone to receive and respond to your report. All incident reports that are written should be emailed to the IA contact at ia@eriecbdd.org, or you can fax it to 419-625-8504. Incident reports must be written and emailed to the county board by 3 o'clock the following day. Certain types of incidences need to be reported to the county board within a 4-hour timeline. To report those, you would need to call the MUI contact at 419-502-4102. The MUI contact will be the one answering the phone between the hours of 8 and 4. If you call after 4 o'clock, you'll be speaking with the on-call SSA, who will also take your report. The categories of MUIs that require this 4-hour time frame in reporting will be discussed on the next slide. When calling in, at times you may be directed to contact the police and/or children's services. Now let's talk about that immediate to 4-hour reporting. The MUI categories listed on this slide are the ones that need to be reported as soon as possible or within the 4 hours. Not reporting in that 4-hour time frame increases the risk to the individual's health and safety. If a provider fails to report in those 4 hours, they may also have an MUI for failure to report. In these types of MUIs, the MUI contact will give a directive to the provider to contact law enforcement where the incident occurred and/or children's services if it's a minor. You will see on here that it says peer-to-peer acts. That's when one individual perpetrates another individual served. Report. The following slides that we're going to be going through will explain the different categories of MUIs. This could include incidents that occur between providers and individuals, or something that the provider has observed someone else doing to an individual. And we will discuss peer-to-peer incidents in another segment. The first category of MUIs is what we call Category A. Category A investigations are conducted by law enforcement, children's services, or the investigative agent, and include the following, which we will discuss further in the next couple slides: accidental or suspicious death, exploitation, failure to report, misappropriation, neglect, physical, sexual, or verbal abuse, prohibited sexual relations, and rights codes. Exploitation. Exploitation often gets confused with misappropriation, but they are different. Exploitation is basically using a person's disability for your advantage. So it's unlawful or improper. It's the act of using an individual or their resources for your personal benefit, profit, or gain. Like I said, it is unlawful and must be reported to the police. It is a crime. An example of exploitation might be you have a cleaning business, and the individual that you provide for loves to clean. So you decide, while you're providing and getting paid to provide services for a specific outcome, you decide that you're going to go do one of your cleaning jobs. Since the individual you're providing for likes to clean, you invite them along and they clean, but you do not compensate them. And you're getting paid for the cleaning job while you're getting paid to provide services. And you do not compensate that, which is not appropriate to do anyway, but when you don't compensate them, that's an example of exploitation. You're getting paid to do the cleaning, but they're not. And so that's just never going to be appropriate. Another example might be you and an individual are out running errands and it's lunchtime and you ask them to pay for your lunch. And they say yes, but like I said, it's not going to be consensual because that person has a disability, may say yes out of fear, may say yes out of not wanting to upset you, but you should never allow an individual to buy you anything or pay for your lunch. Now, it has been ruled before a UI at times when if you had, let's say the next time you went out to lunch, there was proof that you bought their lunch this time to make that even. You return the gesture. But it is never a good idea to allow an individual to buy you something or provide a service for you that they're not getting compensated for. Okay, the next several slides are going to talk about different types of abuse, and abuse is a crime, and crimes must be reported to the police. As far as which jurisdiction to report to, you would report to the jurisdiction of which the crime occurred. Physical abuse is pretty self-explanatory, but it's physical force that would reasonably expect to cause harm, hitting, slapping, pushing, dragging, throwing an object at an individual, anything that causes physical harm to the person. Sometimes the provider is not involved at all, or another individual we serve, and it's not a peer-to-peer. It could be an individual's walking down the street and was attacked and ended up with injuries and went to the hospital. That is still a crime. It still needs to be reported. We may not know who did it to that individual, but that's the job of law enforcement. If the individual is under the age of 18, it also needs to be reported to the Department of Job and Family Services or Children's Services. The police will most likely call Children's Services as well. However, it is our duty to do so as well, just to make sure that that's happened. Sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is any unlawful sexual contact, whether it be touching or an actual sex act. This means it's non-consensual between adults, so one person is not consenting. In the case of a minor under the age of 18, it's never consensual. A child cannot give consent, so that would be automatically considered sexual abuse and non-consensual. Sexual abuse can also be if somebody exposes themselves and their genitalia to someone. It could be in the cases of what we call grooming, which is where maybe pornographic material and or pictures are left out for an individual to see, especially in the case of a minor. Oftentimes sexual abuse can start out as grooming, where the perpetrator tries to gain the trust of the person that they are grooming in giving them gifts and other things to gain trust. Even if knowledge of a sex act has not occurred yet, if you suspect grooming for a minor child, you should report that to Children's Services. Again, it's sexual abuse, physical abuse, and other types of abuse should always be reported to the county board as soon as possible, but within that 4-hour time frame, and as well as the police and or Children's Services. You should contact the authorities right away. If you have not, by the time you call the county board, we will direct you to do so, but you do not need to wait to call the county board to call the police. Verbal abuse. In this slide, I'd like to focus on talking about verbal abuse between an individual without a disability towards a person with a disability. We can get into peer-to-peer verbal abuse in another slide. Verbal abuse is the use of words, gestures, or other communicative means to threaten, harass, coerce, intimidate, or humiliate an individual. There is also a category for verbal abuse as a UI. The difference between UI verbal abuse and an MUI would be that the threat is missing. So for a UI, it may be verbally abusive for a person without a disability, like a provider or family member, to call a person with a disability a bad name. But if the threat towards their health and safety is not there, then it would not meet the criteria for an MUI. The reaction of the individual does not matter. So it used to be that if an individual was verbally abused and they didn't seem upset and it didn't seem to bother them, that they would consider that not an MUI. Now it does not matter. It doesn't matter if they are not upset or how they react. It would still be filed as a verbal abuse MUI. Misappropriation. Misappropriation is a form of theft. There's different ways that people can be thieved against, and misappropriation is a crime that needs to be reported to law enforcement. It could be depriving an individual of their funds, not allowing them to have access to their money. It could be defrauding somebody, which would be identity theft, and or signing checks or other financial documents as though you were the person. If identity theft is found to be the case, not only should it be reported to law enforcement, it should be reported to the 3 major credit bureaus, Equifax, Transperion, and TransUnion. It could be somebody obtaining their property or taking their property. And you'll see that it says amount does not matter unless it's peer-to-peer. And we're going to get into that on the peer-to-peer slide, but it's never acceptable for a provider or any other person to take 1 cent from a person with a disability without their permission. It's theft. Failure to report we touched on earlier. This would be when a DD employee or anybody that's providing services for a person with a disability fails to report abuse or neglect, or fails to report anything that has placed substantial risk of harm or injury on the person with the disability. You want to make sure that you're reporting things to the county board within that 4-hour time frame, because if you don't, then there could be a failure to report MUI. And this also can result in a provider being placed on the abuser registry and possibly result in criminal charges. So make sure that you are reporting things if you have knowledge of it. The next slide is for neglect. Neglect is when you have a duty to do so and you don't. So this could include, but isn't limited to, providing care or treatment to a person that results in serious injury or places an individual or another person at risk of serious injury. This could have something to do with supervision levels. Maybe the person is supposed to have 24-hour care and the provider does not stay with the individual, and because of that, the individual did not get the care that they needed and it resulted in serious injury. Neglect requires a serious injury that would result in medical treatment by a physician, a physician's assistant, or a nurse practitioner. There are times when neglect can be a systems issue, which means it is substantiated, but it has many multiple variables that made it into the neglect category. 1 or more persons can be identified as the PPI. There is times when things may seem like neglect, but they aren't, because they lack that serious injury that has been treated by a medical, by a physician, a PA, or an NP. We will get into when it is a UI in later slides. Prohibited sexual relations. At no time is it appropriate for a DD employee or anyone that's under contract to provide services for a person with a disability to have a sexual relationship with an individual. It can be considered sexual abuse if it is not consensual conduct or contact, but it is always inappropriate for a DD employee to have sexual relations with an individual that is served. Next, we're going to talk about Category B MUIs. Category B MUIs are incidents that are conducted, the investigation is conducted by the investigative agent, and it includes things such as medical emergencies, attempted suicide, peer-to-peer acts, whether they be physical, sexual, or verbal, missing individual, significant injury or death. So medical emergencies is the first slide that we're going to talk about in Category B. There are several types of medical emergencies, and choking, CPR, use of an AED or EpiPen are all common examples. It doesn't mean that you should not provide help to the person, but it just elevates it to an MUI. So if a person's choking and they do need back blows and or the Heimlich maneuver, then you would treat them as such, but it would elevate that to the level of medical emergency. Same goes for CPR and use of an AED or EpiPen. If a person's going into anaphylactic shock and needs the EpiPen and it's administered, or they administer it, then it would be considered a medical emergency. Attempted suicide is a category here for MUI, and oftentimes you might have an individual that states they feel like killing themselves, but they are not following through with anything. They have not made an attempt. There's ideation there, but there's no attempt. That would be treated similarly, but would not be considered an MUI if they did not make the actual attempt. You should always take it seriously when someone says that they are feeling suicidal, even if they have a history of stating that they are suicidal. This could be something that's in their plan. If they say it often, maybe it's something that they say when they're stressed out or depressed, and maybe they just need to call the suicide hotline and talk to somebody. That might be in their plan, and the provider might be there to help them, make that call, or maybe it's in their plan to just talk it out. If an individual has a plan and knows how they would do it, then you want to take them over to the hospital or call the squad, but you need to get them some help immediately. You should never ignore someone saying that they feel like killing themselves. Take all threats seriously. Only when the individual has actually attempted suicide would it be considered an MUI, and then it would result in emergency room treatment or an emergency room visit, inpatient observation, maybe in a psych unit, or going into the hospital and being admitted at the appropriate place. If a person is suicidal or has attempted suicide and is in dire need, then obviously you would call 911. If you are out providing services for them in the community and they are stating that they want to kill themselves and they have a plan, then you would want to drive them to the emergency room, take them there. If you don't know what to do, call the county board for guidance. Peer-to-peer acts. We're going to focus on the physical acts on this slide. And a peer-to-peer physical act is when one or more individuals are involved in a physical act that results in an injury that's treated by a physician, a physician's assistant, or a nurse practitioner. You do not have to be firmly fixed on a peer or targeting a peer to have this reach the level of an MUI. It used to be that you had to be firmly fixed on that person, and that was taken out of the MUI rule. It's often involving strangulation anytime there's a head or neck injury, a bloody nose, bloody lip, or any type of eye injury, concussion, or biting that results in the breaking of the skin. Peer-to-peer misappropriation and exploitation. I know I touched on this earlier, that there's a difference between misappropriation between provider and individual to individual, and exploitation as well. So misappropriation between peers is intentionally depriving or defrauding a peer of real or personal property valued at $20 or more, or if the property has sentimental value to the peer. So with a provider, you can't take 1 red cent. Peer-to-peer acts, it has to be property valued at $20 or more, or the property has to be of sentimental value. Let me give you an example. Let's say an individual got a ring from their grandfather. That's the only thing that they've ever gotten from their grandfather, and it's very sentimental, but the ring came from a bubblegum machine. So the ring is not valued at $20 or more, but it's the grandfather has deceased, and this is a very sentimental thing that he gave because it's what she remembers him by. And she's very, very upset about it because this is a sentimental thing for her. Then that can be considered misappropriation because it had that sentimental value. So it doesn't have to be over the $20, but that's we typically go by. Exploitation is unlawful or improper act of using a peer or the peer's resources for monetary or personal gain. So unlike a provider exploiting an individual, this is when another peer does it. An example of this might be 2 roommates living together, and one of them pays for a shed to store their stuff in, and every month they have a bill and they pay for this shed to rent space in a shed. But the other roommate, who might have a higher cognitive ability, decides that they would like to put their stuff in there also into the shed, but they don't pay the other individual for their portion. So it's when they are benefiting or gaining, and they know that the other individual may not like it or may agree with them because they don't want to make them mad or whatever, but it is using them for your benefit. So the next slide is peer-to-peer sexual acts. Sexual act that is between 2 peers that is not consensual for 1 or more of them would be considered MUI for sexual act. This is different than accidentally brushing up against somebody and touching where you didn't mean to touch. This is touching for sexual gratification specifically. So it doesn't involve horseplay or teasing. If it happens, if you guys are wrestling, consensually wrestling, and somebody happens to touch a private area, then that would not be considered a sexual abuse or sexual act between peer-to-peer if it was accidental. So we're talking about specifically intending to touch somebody for sexual gratification. This is a crime and should be reported to law enforcement. Okay, verbal abuse peer-to-peer. A verbal act, again, it's a little bit different than when it's from provider to individual versus an individual to another individual. It's still the use of words or gestures or communicative means. That could be social media, Facebook, texting, tweeting, Instagram, other forms of media. But it is when the verbiage used is to threaten, coerce, or intimidate a peer. And this is the important difference between a UI or an MUI when it comes to peer-to-peer acts is when there's an opportunity and ability to carry out the threat. So if you have two individuals in a day program setting, and one individual says to the other individual, I don't like you, I'm going to shoot you. But you know that the individual doesn't have any access to any firearms or guns. That individual lives with staff and has 24, they are with their staff 24 hours a day, or some type of staff 24 hours a day. And those two individuals don't ever see each other away from the day program. They get on a bus right after the end of the day, or they get picked up, and they don't have the ability to be around each other for this to actually happen. Then that would just be a UI. So you need to have an opportunity and ability to carry out the threat for it to be filed as an MUI. Unapproved behavior support is the use of an aversive strategy or intervention prohibited by the behavior support rule, or any aversive strategy that was implemented without approval first from the Human Rights Committee or Behavior Support Committee. Basically, it has to be in their plan for you to be able to do any type of aversive action or any type of restraining. It must be something that has already been approved and in their plan. And there also must need to be that risk to health and welfare. So withholding snacks, pop, outings, things like that, those are types of unapproved behavior supports that would just be considered unusual incidents. The reason being is there's no risk to the health and welfare. So it might be considered a rights code violation, but it wouldn't be considered an unapproved behavior support because it's lacking that risk to health and welfare. Now, obviously, no one wants to get an MUI for unapproved behavior support. However, sometimes things need to be done. For example, if you have an individual you're providing services for, they're upset, they decide they're going to run in the middle of traffic. You can see it, they're ready to go, they're going to run out there. Yes, physically stop them from running out into traffic. I would rather have an unapproved behavior support filed than a deceased individual. So yes, things like that, can happen. Use your common sense. Rights code violation also needs to have that risk to health and welfare. It can be, if it has the risk to health and welfare present, then it would be filed as an MUI. But it also can be a UI at times. So anytime you're infringing on the rights of someone with disabilities would be a rights code violation. A difference in between what would be considered a UI or an MUI would be, let's say you tell someone they can't watch TV for the evening because they didn't eat all their dinner. That would be an example of a UI, rights code violation. But if you tell someone who's prone to UTIs that they can't use the restroom, that can be an MUI because you are risking their health and welfare. Missing individual is a category that could also be considered an MUI or a UI. It's an incident that's not considered neglect, and an individual cannot be located after immediate measures have been taken. So if an individual is supposed to have eyes on 24 hours supervision and staff turn around and they're gone and they can't find them and they don't know where they are and they're gone for a period of time, that would be something that would be filed as neglect because they neglected to have that eyes on supervision. But if an individual cannot be located after a period of time and it's longer than the time that is allotted in the ISP for them to be alone, and that there's a risk to health and safety for others or themselves, that would be filed as an MUI. An example might be if you have a person who is a sex offender, they would be a risk to the community and to others. And if they can't be found, and there's a possibility they could be around children, then that's going to be filed because they are a risk to others. You also might have people that are risk to themselves. Maybe they don't have any pedestrian skills and they are prone to walk out in the middle of the street. They are a risk to themselves. So that would be an example of something that would be filed as an MUI because of that health and safety risk. Significant injury is a category that would include injuries that did not result from abuse or neglect, because those would be filed under abuse or neglect. A concussion is going to be also described sometimes as a closed head injury, but anytime there is a concussion or a closed head injury, and that's the diagnosis, it will be considered significant injury and will be filed. Broken or fractured bone always would be filed. This is all, mind you, when the individual is receiving services. If a significant injury happens while a person is not receiving services, it will not be considered an MUI. They have to be receiving some type of DD service at the time of the injury. What's not on here but should be on here would be sprains as well. Sometimes a sprain is only a UI, but it depends on if it's something that needs to be immobilized for 24 hours a day. So if it's a sprain and they give you, you're diagnosed with a sprain and they're giving you a boot, but you're allowed to take the boot off at night and not wear it at night, they just want you to have it on in the daytime, that will most likely not be filed because the immobilization isn't 24 hours a day. Dislocation would always be filed as well. Second or third degree burns, that could be a bad sunburn. If blistering occurs from the burn, it would be considered second or third degree. So if you have a sunburn and there's no blistering, then it would just be a UI. But if there is any type of blistering that happens as a result of the burn, it would be an MUI. Again, casting or splints or other mobilizing devices would be MUIs. A couple considerations here might be if you have fingers that are buddy taped together, your fingers are buddy taped together, they would not count that as casting, splints, or immobilizing. And 5 or more sutures. So if you have an injury and you have 5 or more stitches, then that would be filed as an MUI. And this does not include dermaplast, which is the glue that sometimes hospitals use. So there's no rule on dermaplast. So it would just be stitches. Unanticipated hospitalization is when there's any hospital admission that was not scheduled in advance. So the person may be admitted to the hospital because they're ill, or they went to the emergency room and it resulted in a hospital admission. And so it is considered unanticipated unless it involves a pre-existing condition that is outlined in their ISP, then it would be filed as an MUI. It also now includes any hospital stay that's over 24 hours. So if a person goes to the emergency room and they are there 24 hours later, then that would be considered an unanticipated hospitalization, even though they aren't admitted. But if they are there and it's over 24 hours, they are now considering that an MUI. Death is pretty self-explanatory. It's anytime an individual that's receiving services passes away for any reason. There are 2 different types of categories. The category A is when the death of an individual is resulting from an accident or some type of suspicious circumstance. And for category B, it would be a death of natural causes. There would be no reason to believe that there was anything suspicious going on. Now we're going to discuss Category C MUIs. Category C MUIs are cases that are investigated by the county board and reviewed by the investigative agent. They can include law enforcement involvement, unapproved behavioral support, and the unanticipated hospitalization. Law enforcement. A law enforcement MUI is anytime an individual is involved with the police and the incident leads to charges being pressed on the individual. They may be arrested, incarcerated, and recently they've added tasing to law enforcement MUI. So if the individual is tased, it would automatically be an MUI. Notifications for MUIs. The provider, including if the county board is the provider, needs to make notification on the same day that the incident has been discovered. The notifications are going to vary depending on who is involved in the person's life. That person might have a guardian or another person that they've identified as a caretaker. The SSA needs to be notified. And other providers of services is necessary to ensure continuity and care for the individual, such as if a person has an injury, a significant injury, it may be at a day hab program and is later going to be going home to home staff, the home staff would need to be notified of what has happened in order to properly care for the individual. Staff or family living in the individual's home who have responsibility for the individual's care should be notified. And agency providers shall implement a written procedure for the internal review of all MUIs and take reasonable steps to prevent reoccurrence. Measures need to be taken at all times to ensure the health and welfare of the individuals. Sometimes that might include removal of an employee if the employee is the primary person involved, or PPI, or removal of another individual if it's a peer-to-peer act. And it's going to affect that person's health and welfare. So if two individuals go to a day program and one individual was doing something to harm another individual, they may be removed from the program until the outcome of the investigation. Sometimes agencies need to remove an employee from direct contact with an individual when there's an allegation of physical or sexual abuse until an investigation is completed and or the provider has reasonably determined that it's no longer necessary for the person to be removed from the individual. There's nothing that preludes any employer from removing an employee if they believe that it's necessary to. Sometimes this occurs in cases of verbal abuse, neglect, or misappropriation. They usually will do their own internal investigation to determine what's happened. And an investigation ensues immediately by either the police, children's services, or the investigative agent. Once you have completed the training, you'll want to copy the link that's listed on this slide and paste it onto your web browser, which will take you to a quiz. In order to pass the quiz, you will need to get an 80% or better. You're able to take the quiz as many times as you need in order to pass it. Once you have passed the quiz, a certificate of completion will be emailed to you. Thank you for your participation, and if you have additional questions, please feel free to contact any of us that are listed on this slide. This concludes the training.